Are you
Give him a
ready?
nickname. And in the red corner, we have Evan Folds from B Agriculture. Are you ready to rumble? All right. We ready?
All
right, everybody. Welcome back to the show. Today we have Evan Folds from B Agriculture. Hey, Evan. Welcome. Let's get into it. Just let us know who you are, what you're doing, and tell us what's up.
Oh man, I love it. I love it. Appreciate the container and the opportunity to communicate about these important subjects. I think what I do and what I've come to with 20 years of thinking about these things and trying to create opportunities and action within it is, what we think we grow, right? This idea that, our awareness of how living systems work drives our actions. Like perspective drives our actions, right? So an example of that is, if we imagine that pests and weeds and disease, et cetera, are bad luck, the pest flew by my neighborhood and landed on my plant, it makes sense to try to go nuke it and kill the symptom effectively, right? But it's a symptom. It's not the root of the problem. And we're creating as much imbalance as we are seemingly helpful. So my background is in what I'll call regenerative agriculture. It was sort of in that space before the term was centralized, but it was really initially inspired by what's called biodynamic agriculture. And this is the work of Rudolf Steiner. He actually didn't use the word biodynamic, but he introduced the principles and the methods in 1924. It was the first reaction to chemical farming. And what he was asked, he never did anything unless he was asked. If you hadn't looked into Rudolf Steiner, I believe it's a rabbit hole, but highly suggest doing that. And his agriculture courses were 8 lectures that he gave in response to the prompt of how do we regenerate the life force of our farms. What had happened was, I think most people are aware that conventional agriculture came out of the world wars, right? Like the pesticides were originally and herbicides were originally used in wars, and it was the same with glyphosate and Agent Orange coming through Vietnam. This is a real rhythm of how we develop conventional agriculture, which should speak to its significance in terms of its success potential in living systems. But so the farmers were hooked with the increased yields, but they started seeing diseases in their animals first that they'd never experienced before. And so these farmers in the time in Eastern Europe came to Dr. Steiner and said, how do we regenerate the life force of our farms? And he nailed it and went to the stars and celestial cycles and, just incredible wisdom. But he didn't address, because he wasn't asked primarily, things that are entirely relevant to agronomy, mineral balance, microbial diversity, cover crops, these things that are tools that we need to use as farmers. He was more introducing this rhythm of what I'll call life force to talk about it. But he didn't address the rest of it. And what came to me in thinking about these things over time was initially what I called bioenergetic agriculture, for lack of a better word. The impulse was that, a living system is physical, it's mineral, it's biological, and it's energetic. It's like 4 legs of a chair, right? And conventional agriculture is physical and it's mineral. And then it, creates, you plow and you fertilize, if you will, and you create all of the problems that we chase around as symptoms. Organics brings in the biological, sort of backs in. It doesn't mandate biological diversity, et cetera, but it tries to ensure that there are natural materials being used. But both discount this concept of life force. That there's more to life than what's physically here, right? Which is really what launched me into all of this, was that simple idea. Why does a plant grow up against gravity? Like, we don't really have a clear answer to that, right? We just sort of ignore it. Sort of like, the heart is not a pump. A little thing this big can't move 400 miles of blood, right, through capillaries, and the blood is moving, the pump is regulating, but we don't have an answer of how that works, so we don't address it. And this, frankly, is the world that we live in. And I'm just endlessly fascinated by this idea of, how do we become what we are if we don't know where we came from, if we don't know what we are, right? And so biodynamics really is a window into how all of that can play together. And so what I saw is the ability to mash all of that together as a platform of consulting to say, it may be a biodynamic farmer that needs a soil test. It may be a conventional farmer that's going to woo-woo the witchcraft of biodynamics, and you start with, microbes, because they think microbes are negative, for example. So it creates this platform, and out of that, that's actually where the name for my company came from, Be Agriculture. I was making an acronym out of bioenergetic agriculture, BE Agriculture, and it hit me. Whoa, be agriculture, like be a part of agriculture. We are, whether we like it or not. We're agricultural beings, right? And it's the fact that we've lost that thread in our identity that's giving us what we got. And that's basically the lens that I worked through. And what came after that was this insight that agriculture is more than farming. Again, we're agricultural beings. And the essence of that, one of my favorite quotes, Wendell Berry said, eating is an agricultural act, right? Like we're all a player in the system. If we don't identify with that, well, we're getting, taken advantage of. And that's basically what the modern food system has done. Out of convenience and taste, we've food scienced ourselves into an idea of undermining what we would want if we were asked, right? And so that premise of not just farming, but also eating, and then also the impact of how we grow and how we eat on human and environmental health. So the prism is food, farming, and health. It's like a threefolding. And when you have that lens, agriculture deserves a seat at every table of decision. And so, with that launch pad, Be Agriculture is really trying to provide, some storytelling around that, but also some really practical tools that people can use when they're getting started, mostly to learn about how these things work. Because it's not about stereo instructions. It's a living, dynamic situation, and everyone is different. Every landscape is different, every application. So, but if you can kind of deduce the principles of that, then we have the ability to move forward. And effectively, that's really what permaculture is, right? It's not telling you what to do or how to do it necessarily. It's giving you the principles that should guide the activity that you see as relevant in the application that you're undertaking. So there's really a parallel, not really intentionally, but I think there's just some truth to found in that. So that's a little bit where I've come from, and my experience of running this garden center that I referenced was sort of like a boot camp for me. And at one point, I had 5 different companies. I had a wholesale company manufacturing compost tea brewing systems. We built the market for Vortex style compost tea brewing, had dealers and growers all over the country, and had an organic lawn care company, a farm that did 75 families through a CSA program, and a commercial wheatgrass microgreen business that all operated out of this retail store. It was way too much, but it really gave me a lived experience in an intense way that, again, I had no designs for this, but that, allowed me to have some value to speak into other projects and help people with it. What I learned was that my passion was really about that give and that take, that if I can pay forward what I've been blessed to learn and been given over time, and I can learn from people, and there's that spark of interest there, like I could spend the rest of my life in that moment, right? So I realized that I was consulting through a retail store for 15 years, right? And I would sit there for the lady growing tomatoes in her backyard with an hour if she was interested. And at some point, Amazon.com and the legalization of cannabis threw a monkey wrench into the business model that had kind of developed. And it wasn't working as well. And that was about 3, 4, 5 years ago. And I took a step back and started this consulting company explicitly. And it was really humbling to kind of clear the table and see what filled that void, right? And some of it was, meeting you guys and really understanding how I can bring some level of value to the whole, because no one can be all of it, right? So I'm just endlessly inspired to connect with people in this work. And one of the tools that came out of it was what I typically call a living landscapes program. Where I live is almost completely urbanized. We don't have traditional farms, and I consult with farmers all over the country too. But the program really came out of the organic lawn care company that I had, and it was sort of an R&D trip. We brewed compost tea in this retail store on a daily basis, and it actually invented this process called perpetual brewing, where we had an 85-gallon brewer, and if we had these compost tea cards, and it had 5 little check marks, like a subway card sort of idea, right? And it had a $25 value. We'd sell a gallon of tea for $5 because you can't buy it at a store. It cost us 50 cents to brew it. Actually, it was an amazing business model. And we would give people 5 free gallons. Cost us $3. It was $25 value to the client, right? And it would bring them back in the store weekly to use the tea and give them a lived experience of how this stuff works. So we're not explaining microbes to people. We're showing them that it works. And then they're coming back like how did that work again? Right. And they're engaged and not glossing over from the newness of the living soil food web and this sort of thing. And so, ran the course with that and, really came out of one year we were in a drought, happened to be, and I was looking for lawn care companies, right, that could use this and have their own experience with it because I didn't want to go buy all the equipment to be a lawn care person. And I really wanted to validate what I knew was true and had experienced, in my own anecdotal way. I wanted to validate that. And so I met this guy and he had kids in school and had to reach this moment with what he was doing, in his conventional lawn care stuff that he knew wasn't right, but didn't know where to go. And you can't go to the expert and learn how to do this stuff, right? I'll put that in quotes. We got too many experts in that way. But unfortunately, they're trained in sort of the opposite of how we would want to show up, which is really confusing. But this guy had an experience that during this drought, where the landscapes he was using, the biological approach, were orders of magnitude better than the other ones. And he saw it work. It wasn't just the right thing to do. And we went 3 years we didn't spray any pesticides. It wasn't our business. We refer people. And 9 times out of 10, when the idea came up and we said, that's not something that we do, we wouldn't judge people. We would say, look, we can refer somebody to you. And it would blow people away that we wouldn't take advantage of this economic opportunity, right? They were like, it sort of checked people. They're so used to, I want this done. Okay, well, I'll do it for you for the money, right? We were more like, that's not what we're doing. And maybe you can go there. And they'd say, oh, well, maybe you're onto something. And it would open them up to this new way of doing it. So there's just so many experiences that I would love to connect with other companies out there on the value of being able to articulate what this Living Landscapes program is, because really what it does is initially it downloads the living soil principles. What is the soil food web? Who are the players? What is a protozoa? What is a nematode? What is the physical, mineral, biological, energetic capacity, cation exchange capacity, pH? What are these things, right? Because we sit with this example, pH is a good one, that somehow it's a good metric to evaluate soil health. It actually is just a measurement of how many hydrogen ions are present, right? It doesn't speak to what's deficient. It doesn't speak to what you need to do. It's not really helpful at all, other than telling you hit your mark with the mineral balance in the soil, which was all discovered and divulged by William Albrecht and Kerry Reams and people over the years. We know the sweet spot that the soil wants to hold. And the irony is, if you balance it within the ranges, the pH is always perfect. But if the pH is what's driving your action, and the example that people may be familiar with is lime, and lime can be dolomitic, calcium, magnesium. It can also be high calcium, but just talk about it in context of calcium. If you're got a low pH, you've got a lot of hydrogen ions present, because pH is an algorithm of hydrogen ions. The exchange capacity is negatively charged. What fills that exchange capacity is hydrogen, positive element, right? If the soil is empty. That's basically what a low pH is an empty soil. So when you're adding lime, you're adding calcium, positive element. All bonds are stronger than hydrogen. So the calcium kicks the hydrogen out of the neighborhood, right? That's why the pH goes up. So you can calculate the amount of calcium you need, or lime, for that impulse, to say you need this amount of lime per square foot based on your pH. And you can make the pH number right. But what if you have a manganese deficiency or an iron deficiency or something that the lime's not adding or addressing, right? You can correct the number, say everything's right with the world, and still have haywire in the balance in your soil and it not be healthy at all. And this is what happens to people. When you go to the extension service and you get a soil test, the response of what you should do is pH driven. So it's a bit like going to the doctor and them giving a pill to manage the symptom, right? They're not asking you to change your diet and looking at you as an individual, right? They're cookie cuttering this approach of managing symptoms. So that's actually turns out to be a really powerful way for people to understand what I do, because they've come to this with their own health, right? They just haven't projected and applied it to their landscapes. And that understanding hits people as truth every time if people are open. And it's a really powerful tool to connect with people in your local communities around what differentiates how you're approaching the work relative to everyone else. Because lawn care, in an urban sense, is really like a bank. Like they all sell the same thing, right? It just comes down to personalities. And when the personality is not strong enough to, overcome the dysfunction of your landscape, you find the next guy, right? Or gal or whatever. So, the ability to show up with this kind of story and dialogue is really powerful. And then to be able, so we download how it works, and then we set up an initial call that will give people an ability to ask questions about any of that, and then center people on what the soil testing process is. And I've developed this simple soil solutions prescription process that takes what's called base saturation, which is what I was describing a minute ago. When you're not just focused on the pH, you're looking at the mineral balance. Space saturation approach. And Logan Labs is the lab that I work with. And when I get that data set, I can push it through the range of what it should be. And it'll give me a readout of the deficiencies and excess that can then allow me to calculate how much of each element you need to add to the soil. So to try to simplify that, if you're 36 pounds deficient in calcium every 100,000 square feet, and lime is 36% calcium, well, then you need 100 pounds of lime. Not because the pH is low, but because the calcium is deficient, right? And so you do that same process for all of the other elements, and what you end up with is this is what you need to add custom based on what's deficient in your soil. So that is a part of the ecosystem report, which is the deliverable engagement. And the other piece that's really powerful is a product audit. And I had one woman that I was working with in Florida, and she had just bought a new home. And it's really interesting. A lot of the people that I engage with in food forest work, it seems like the majority of them have just bought their property or new home, which is just a window into how much energy there is and intention, frankly, from people to do these things, which is really exciting. But this woman had just bought a place, and it was a homeowners association. And she, they were straight chemicals, and she knew it. She was a yoga instructor. Like, her whole life was pure and intent. And here's this chemical company that was, and she wasn't having it. So she fired him. Then she hired this new company that was saying all the right things. And I said, oh, that's great. You got to go to them and get me a list of the products, because she hadn't asked, right? She was just listening to the story they were telling. And when they showed what they were using, it was basically the same thing as the other company. They just added some humic acid in there so that they could talk about it differently. And so it was really alarming for her, right? And that's a way into some of the value that can come out of this. Is unfortunately, most of the people, if not all of them, that show up for this type of work understand how damaging things like Roundup and other synthetic chemicals can be. Yet a lot of those people have Roundup in their garage, right? And so it's like really syncing with that is a real pivot point, right? So you kind of got this information download, this product audit to kind of reflect on, what are we using? Is it helping? And here's some things that maybe you might want to use differently. And then the prescription process that culminates in, once we understand the vision of the project, a write-up of next steps. Do we need to increase the organic matter and bring in compost? If you're 2 to 3% organic matter, if you're 5%, it's a choice, right? If it's 2%, you need it. Do you need to increase your cation exchange capacity? Well, maybe the focus is on humates and building that capacity, but really understanding, a report that can inform people that they hopefully can take to someone locally to undertake. And so that's, I guess, a good lap around the track of the Living Landscapes program, the ecosystem report deliverable, or where I came from. So where we go from here, I suppose, is up to us. So I don't know if there's any insight that you'd like to reference above and beyond that.
Will you show us a copy of maybe a soil report?
Yeah, that may be helpful to talk through. So this is some data from a presentation, and I think this may be helpful to explain some of the dynamics of the soil. So notice on this soil, so this is where I live in Wilmington, North Carolina, and we tend to have higher calcium, low pH, but higher calcium in our exchange capacity. And so I'll show you that in data. So you see how the pH here is low. It's 5.5. The conventional wisdom is to use lime to make that 6 to 6.5, somewhere in there. You can notice that you're right at the 60%, basement of what you want in your exchange capacity already. So if you went in and you added lime, what it would end up looking like was something like this, where you've got 80% calcium. pH is right, 80% calcium above the range that you want, but a total deficiency in everything else that's positive. See the charges over here, right? Mm-hmm. So you've got deficient magnesium, potassium, all of the elements, maybe other than sodium. And so the takeaway here is, again, it's not a pH driven approach. What we would do is take this data, we'd run it through a spreadsheet that the soil test reports, and the spreadsheet is loosely made around the desired range, and then that would give us, what we're going to do from it. So that's one way into the data, and you can see, again, William Albrecht was, the champion of this, and they literally took soil samples over and over and over and reflected that based on the quality of the crops being grown, and then deduced the healthy range out of the crop presentation, right? So this is not conceptual. This is plants speaking to us. What does the soil want? And an important point here is that, soil microbes and weeds are both moving towards this balance in the exchange capacity. The microbe's job is to mature the soil over time, and but the weed, and this is a really powerful, the book that inspired me initially, I always love to share it, is called Secrets of the Soil. And if people want to seek that book out, you'll have your mind blown. It's unbelievable. And one of the chapters is on weeds, and weeds as guardians and of the soil. This dynamic accumulator reality, right? That weeds grow for very specific purposes within the ecosystem. They're not just bad luck. Weed seeds can stay dormant for up to 50 years in the soil. So it's not about they came from my neighbor's yard or all these stories we tell ourselves. I mean, you've blown a dandelion seed before, right? It's like we don't live in bubbles. So this idea of and it's the same with microbes. They don't jump over the fence, right? So like really getting synced with the importance of these things can allow us to work with a full deck. But that idea of the weed is really a good fascination point into this, because I literally got to a point in the lawn care company that we were doing, because we had the higher calcium, we don't have dandelions that grow in Wilmington. I mean, you'll see them here and there, but they're not everywhere. I'm from 3 hours away where the soil is clay and different soil types and real deficiencies in calcium, and there are dandelions everywhere. It's the impulse the ecosystem is sending in order to regenerate the calcium. If you ever tried to pull a dandelion up, its taproot goes down to the middle of the earth, right? And what it's doing is fixing in the subsoil what's available and from the air, and then the annual weed is dying every season to regenerate what's deficient in that topsoil, right? So once we sync with this idea of this is what weeds are doing, the idea is not necessarily to wait on the weeds, but to bring the deficiencies to the system in the form of like the building materials, if you will, so that the ecosystem can catalyze itself faster, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not a matter of if this stuff works, it's how it works, right? The question is really, does the client have the patience to allow it to work? So once we've got the information, the question then is, all right, well, what is the budget to get there faster? And what we found is, especially back to that idea that how big of a tool this is for service companies. If you understand, maybe there's 5% of people that would have a lawn care company to begin with. There's at least another 5% of people that would never have a lawn care company because they know what's being applied to their landscape, right? And there's no option for that population of people. So what you find is when you can, with integrity, map that space out, there's an existing business model. You don't have to talk people into this. There's so many people that already understand the truth in this. They just don't know where to start, and they don't want to do it on their own, right? So the point there is there's a real opportunity for people that can organize around these types of things. And another story that I would share is inevitably it would be like the husband and the wife that you're talking to in their landscape, right? And this is a total generalization, but it was uncannily true. The husband wanted no weeds in the yard, right? And because that's the conventional wisdom, and the wife tended to understand about the chemicals and didn't care about the weeds and just wanted it to be clean. And so, it wasn't until the soil test data was generated and I could show the husband in this example, why their landscape looks the way that it is, why the weeds are growing. They can see the deficiencies analytically, which is how we teach ourselves to think that things are true. We have to measure it, right? We can't measure everything, but it's a bridge. So when you generate that data and you're able to hold the space and explain to these people with their natural skepticism why these things are the way that they are, that's what breaks down. I mean, I can sit here till I'm blue in the face and try to describe to someone why this works, but when they see the data, it changes things, right? So even if you don't respond to the specifics of what's deficient, simply just understanding where it is and understanding that, oh, you've got enough calcium, you need to use, garden or lawn products that are more potassium based because you're deficient in calcium. It could be that simple. You don't even need to buy minerals and do it all specifically. You just need to know where to drive, right? So, that's kind of a window into that. And you can see this is a really good way of, I think, expressing it as well. This was some beds in a landscape in a yard. And, when you're taking a soil sample, you really want to take an average of the place that you're going to treat similarly. So like in a landscape, if you have a garden and you have a lawn and you have, shrub beds, you don't want to mix a sample from each of those together because you're going to treat them differently, right? But if you had a front and a backyard lawn, for example, you might want to mix those together because you're not going to remember over there it's deficient in this, and so you sort of want to kind of put all of that together and then take multiple samples within that and get the average, and you can see how differently these soils showed up within the landscape. You can see the organic matter of the beds is almost 10 times higher than the lawn. It's because somebody brought some fill in, right? And this is a real lesson on the reality of land development. You're basically starting from scratch. I mentioned earlier, the microbes don't parachute in or jump over the fence. They're not mobile. They move a micrometer in their lifetime, right? And if you think about the significance of microbes, they make really important things like beer and cheese, and they're alchemists, right? So they're creating this critical role in the landscape, and if they're not there, they can't do it. So this idea that they can just manifest is not necessarily accurate either. So it gets back down into this understanding. It's not like you have to 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It's that if we don't have a clear view of what microorganisms are, how important they are, where to find them, and how to work with them, we're going to be working against ourselves. And I think if people can leave the work that I do with a clear understanding of how this stuff works, and they're thinking about it coherently, then we win the day, and the rest will take care of itself.
Yeah, that's a good prompt there too, talking about the organic matter. Why, maybe touch a little bit on why people shouldn't just throw a bunch of compost in their soil and hope for the best.
Yeah, no, that's actually a really rich question, because what comes to me is this book. I think it's called The Insatiable Gardener. Steve Solomon. I could be wrong on a word there, but he's an agronomist, and he wrote this book about nutrient density in crops. And he lived in Oregon back in the 70s when the Rodale movement was really becoming popularized. And what that basically championed was compost fixes everything, right? All we need to do is add compost to the soil and it's fine, and we win. And he was living in this community in Oregon, had a piece of property, and was eating all the food off of his land, doing everything right, naturally, organically, the whole thing. And his teeth were falling out. And he got this job to write this book, and him and his wife moved to Fiji, a volcanic island. And they didn't have access to organic food, so they were buying just food from the supermarket that was conventional. And his teeth healed. Like he healed himself eating this conventional food that was not clean in the same way that organic food was, but that was much more nutrient dense, right? And it was sort of a pivot for him to say, look, organic is not the end all be all. It's part of it. Don't get me wrong, but you can't just add compost to poor soil and expect it to be able to achieve what a volcanic soil would, out of the box. So, the organic matter, it's also, I think, really important to understand, soil is sand, clay, and organic matter on paper. Now it's dynamic and much more than that, but to talk about it, sand, clay, and organic matter, the sand is neutral. It's like perlite in a potting soil. It just allows drainage and it's there to hold space. The organic matter and the clay are a net negative charge. And that's why you have a cation exchange capacity. A cation is a positive element, and anion is a negative element. Opposites attract, right? So if the soil is negatively charged net, it holds positive elements, cation exchange capacity, right? That's where that comes from. So it turns out that clay is pretty much solely negatively charged, but organic matter has both positive and negative charges. It brings in the anion exchange capacity, which is typically not something that's measured on a soil test. But there are, the majority of what plants require is positively charged. There are some elements, boron and phosphorus particularly, that are negatively charged that need to be held by the soil. So point being is, if you have a totally clay soil or a totally sandy soil, your antidote is organic matter, right? That's what you need to bring But it doesn't just fix everything, because then you have to think about the mineral balance within what can be held in that scenario. And that's what we were referencing a minute ago with the prescription piece. And then the last piece to your question that I think is really important around compost is a really easy word to say. The majority of commercial compost formulators are not making humus, which is really the essence of what composting is. It's perfect plant food. It's why you don't have to fertilize a forest and it grows trees, right? It's like the soil is alive and there's no crutch needed. That's our goal, and we're not trying to make an old growth forest out of our landscapes, but that's the goal of maturing the soil. And so the idea here is, if you're out to get compost, which the majority of people should and probably will need to do in a residential landscape and even in farmlands, that it's important to ask the person you're buying the compost from, have they done biological testing, microbe testing on their soil? And it's not to like parse, did they do it correctly or not? It's just simply to say, do you know what a microorganism is? Because the reality is most of the commercial compost formulators, they aren't even aware of that. I mean, we make compost in our county out at the landfill in this in-vessel digester, and our entire decision-making apparatus, elected officials, believe that we are composting. Well, it's like a drop in the ocean of what comes through in terms of the volume, for one. It's not even serious. It's like a toy. It costs $450,000. And they're proud of buying another one and calling it a day, right? Half the landfill can be composted, so there's just no awareness. But the people that are running the program at the landfill don't even know what a microorganism is. Like they've never heard of like that they make compost when I went out to talk to them for the first time. So it's just a small window into how, unfortunately, how difficult it is to find high quality organic matter. There are good ones out there, but just all that to wrap it up, just ask that question. And if they can't answer it, take a beat, right? And that's one of the things that I can help with is to be a liaison. I did a living landscapes program the other day for a woman that was in Pennsylvania near Amish country. And she was able to reach out and do a kind of a survey of some local companies and found this commercial company, and she sent it to me, and I was able to call them and get their testing and give her the peace of mind that, yeah, this is great stuff, right? There's a real value in that, right? And so again, that my impetus is not to make myself the center of that, but to empower people to be able to navigate this on their own.
And understand it, right? Have help. Yeah.
What we think we grow, somebody said that to me long ago, and it's just like, whoa, that's like the simplest, most profound thing I've ever heard. That's the world that we live in. We're all thinking about things in the ways that we've been told, not thinking for ourselves, right? And undermining what we would want if we were asked. I actually had to come up with a word for it, destructive. This idea that productivity is undermining what we would want if we were asked. It's fascinating. We do that it's like pesticides, or even, it's not really a judgment. It could be driving a car. It's a finite resource. Gets you to A to B, right? You need it, but it's polluting the environment. It's finite. It's all the things that, we wouldn't really want to do if we were asked. So can we recognize it as such and sit with it and then chart a course of action accordingly? And we have that opportunity with permaculture and food forest development. But the worst thing in the world is to have this impulse go through the investment and energy or finances, depending on how you're working, and plant it in a dead landscape that the former owner used ChemLawn on for 10 years, assuming that it's going to work. And then it doesn't, right? So I guess within that, I also wouldn't want to leave people with the idea that there's these things you have to do before you get started, right? Like you can do all of what we're talking about here as you're planting and as you're going. The key is not, once you've planted it, to not provide this level of knowledge and impulse and diversity of material to work with from the plant, and most specifically not to continue to use your Miracle-Gro and herbicides and pesticides once you've done it. And doors keep opening in my mind, and I know we've got a container here, but this is a really powerful point. Is plants have to have, let's say, 13 elements. Some people will tell you 17. It's a bit of an argument, but let's say 13 elements. It's called the essential elements. That's essentially what we're working with through the prescription process. The extension services don't look for all of those. They're looking for the pH, right? So they're not even looking for everything plants have to have, which, that's what this process does. But let's also think about what plants want, right? Which is a totally different conversation than what they have to have. So there's this concept of trace elements and, bringing in all of these. Why would Mother Nature make an element not needed in the soil, right? Even if the plant doesn't use it, the microbes use it as a cofactor to produce the enzymes. You know, microbes don't have mouths, right? They offer an enzyme that breaks down and melts the banana peel. So if they don't have all of the trace elements to work with, it's like hiring somebody to build a house and giving them half the tools. It's not that they can't do it, but they're working on this level that's exhausting them and producing disease and all the things that we're chasing around trying to kill. So it's a vicious cycle, right? And you can see with that alone, you can think your way out of that. That's really the essence of it. It's to empower people to think for themselves in a way that can help them navigate how these things work. It's really that simple.
Evan, I've watched a lot of Dr. Elaine Ingham's and work, and I'm curious of your quick take on it in terms of, a lot of times I've heard her say that, you know, a lot of these other things, like you mentioned, Lyme, if you get the microbes working, it's almost like they unlock the soil for you, and a lot of these things that weren't accessible are. Can you explain kind of maybe to what point do we really need to be adding things if you're really focusing on the microbes?
Yeah.
You know, as far, you know what I mean? You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Elaine Ingham is a rock star, laid just unbelievable groundwork that, a lot of us wouldn't be able to do what we do without her work. So I don't want this to come across as a criticism, but I don't share her perspective that microbes fix everything. There's an element of like compost fixes everything in that, right? So I see it as a very integral and maybe the most important aspect of the whole, but not all of it, right? So the story I was sharing with the Fiji trip with that author, right, is a way into that. And it's not that the microbes couldn't have fixed that scenario in time, but like how much time do we have, right? Like, or can we wait on the forest to develop over a 100-year period, or for the landscape to mature? Most people can't, right? So the way I like to think about it is the microbes are the construction workers, right? And then the essential elements are really the building materials, the things that are turned into plants, that are turned into the physicality of what's happening. And then the trace elements, sort of that what the plants want impulse, is the toolkit, right? So if you don't have all of those things identified and referenced, and you're not providing the materials, the physical materials that are required to allow that to work, well, then the system is deficient, right? So the key is to make sure that you're thinking about things physically, minerally, biologically, and energetically. And I would put Elaine's work into the biological realm, and thinking about the diversity of the microbes in that space. And yeah, can those construction workers work with their bare hands and fix it all in time? Of course they can. But if the human, with our knowledge, can bring the spec building materials all palleted up for the construction workers to put together, it all happens quicker, right? So it's not really a matter of right or wrong. It's more of like the speed of development, I think, is what I would respond to within that.
Sure.
But such important work she's done for sure.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Anybody else?
Well, Evan, you said one time to me, and I've always thought of it this way, but I didn't get the wording until you said it, that most compost that you can buy commercially is just mulch.
Right.
And I always sort of treated it as such because I never had really high quality compost available to me.
Yeah.
Which I think that's great. So thank you for that. Just shifting my mind around, like, oh yeah, it's mulch. So let's say, like most people, that's all you're going to have if you need to start a garden or farm to bring in this, mulch that they call compost or what. It was finely broken down mulch is basically
Right.
what it is. So what would you just advise someone to do in order to get the organic matter higher, the microbes higher, if that's all they have access to?
Yeah, man, another great question. That was actually our scenario when we did the lawn care company I was describing. Is we had to buy this compost called McGill compost, and it was uber commercial industrial waste, excuse basically, and it's got biosolids in it. I mean, EPA standards allow biosolids in compost. So just stop right there and you can understand the majority of what's out there on a scaled level is not about creating perfect plant food. It's about processing industrial waste, right? So, with that clarity, it was sort of hard to justify buying this compost to use in a landscape, but it's all we had available, right? So what we would do is we'd bring it in bulk, and you can buy this stuff for, $30, $50 a yard, and some of them will deliver it to you. And we would stage it, and then we would brew compost teas with the diversity of soil food web microbes that we knew was there. And we would spray these piles down. And then we actually access what's called a soil vita test. It's made Woods End in Massachusetts, and it's a respiration test. And it's based on a 1 to 10 model. And if you get a 1, it's immature. And if it's 10, it's the most mature. And it's basically just measuring the respiration of aerobic microbes. So the more they're respiring, the less mature it is, right? It's still trying to finish it. So you can get this metric. And then once you've figured out this source of compost, when I get it, it's a 2. When I spray the tea and I, wait a month and turn it once a week, it's a 7, right? Once you've done that, then you know it. You don't have to test it every single time, right? But that's how we worked it out. So that's probably not feasible for an individual to run an operation like that. So to your question, what I would suggest is buy the organic matter, the mulch, right? With the knowledge that it's not going to perform the way that you want. And one of the tricks is, this used to happen all the time with that poor compost. I had this garden center and people would buy it and fill up a raised bed. And it would work decent the first year because there's a certain solubility to it, right? It's not all negative, right? There's still plant food in the material you're buying. But once that mineralization is gone or used and you've harvested all your tomatoes and mined that scenario of its value, and you're adding half of it back as Miracle-Gro, for example, things start falling apart, right? And so almost it was uncanny. People would buy this stuff and then the next season it just didn't work as well. And it was just degenerating, right? And that's basically what people experience in a landscape. If you're starting, we would have people that moved from Ohio or New York where you could kind of plant the tomato with your Miracle-Gro in the backyard and it would work great. And then they'd move where I lived and do the same thing and it just wouldn't work. That was basically our business for 10 years, right? 15 years. Is fielding these people moving into town and saying, look, I can't, what am I missing, right? So with that knowledge, again, you can arm it. So, I would focus on sourcing microbes that are diverse, use the mulch, inoculate, that is the term, with the microbes that you do want. The best source of that, you can buy some things commercially, but honestly, just go out to the woods or some unadulterated natural environment and just get a couple gallons of material out of the soil and put that in your compost. And then you're working with the full deck, right? It's like, try drinking a beer without yeast. Ain't gonna happen, right? It's the point. So, once you have that knowledge, then it's about, yeah, man, it's unfortunate I got to buy this cheap mulch, but you know it and you can compensate for it. So you're never put in the corner in a way that you can't work with at the end of the day.
Love that idea.
Yep.
It's a great idea.
That's it. Teammates.
Yep.
There's so much to unpack, with what you were saying, that I think it'd be amazing to have a soil course, and have it broken down and get some of these building blocks, because, I think when people take the PDC, for example, they get a quick dose of things, but to take in what you've taken in, I feel like it's there. But, I guess bottom line is people don't need to understand how it all works together. Right. Obviously, through your help and being able to just get started in a real practical way makes a lot of sense. But for me, I get super fascinated with the idea of making it really simple for people to understand, so that they, like you said, they understand the why, and then it becomes a situation where you just wouldn't do it a different way. You know what I mean? You would, yeah. And it's not to say you have the answer for every situation necessarily, but I feel like soil is a great place to start, isn't it? I mean, just you connect in and you get like you said, those important things, the food, the nutrition, the energy, it all comes together to me.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's so important, and you're right. And your reference to something really important. I certainly don't have it all figured out. And to your point, you don't need to, right? And it's one of the fascinating things about microbes, and part of the story that Elaine tells that's relevant, but it's not the whole also, in that, microbes self-organize. You don't need to go selecting the right ones, right? You just need to access the right source for them, and then they'll figure it out. Now, that's a different animal than minerals. They're not alive. They can't replicate and, understand innately because of their understanding in the way that they understand what they need to do in the ecosystem. Minerals don't work like that. So there's a certain element of human responsibility there, right? Like if we're just adding lime, I worked with this couple the other day, and the guy was using, that they just bought their home from, was using gypsum for gophers. I'd never heard of that before. I don't know if that works or not. I'm not endorsing it, but that's what he was doing. They found a bag of gypsum in the shed, and he'd been using that on gophers probably forever. And his soil was like 85% calcium sulfate, right? Or the idea of using Epsom salts on tomatoes. It's kind of like one of those myths out there of something good to do. Now, it's not hurting tomato, but if all you're adding is magnesium sulfate every year, what's going to happen? You're going to have a high magnesium and deficiency in everything else. You're creating just as much imbalance as you are creating balance. So anytime you're using an individual element, you should really measure what you're using. Otherwise, use organic materials that have already done that balancing for you. You know, like sea minerals. They're balanced naturally in a way that mimics the mineral balance in human blood. There's a sweet spot. I mean, think about all of the inputs to the ocean on a second by second basis. Yet the ocean mineral balance stays relatively the same, right? There's a reason for that. So if you access sea minerals, one of the best things to use in a landscape, because then there's over 90 elements in there. You don't even have to think about all of those trace elements that I was referencing, right? And so there's a lot of depth. Maynard Murray is a good window into that. We could probably spend an hour on him alone, but if he wrote a book called Sea Energy Agriculture that's worth reading. But so that point of kind of the microbes self-organizing, you don't, and I think what I see Elaine Ingham, maybe final point, is geeking out on all of the stereo instructions, and and it's endlessly fascinating and totally relevant, but I think it can overwhelm and push people away in a sense too, right? You don't have to your point, know all of that. You just need to make sure that you're accessing a naturally balanced inoculation. And then let's perform a technical process on the elements, because we can screw that up, right? That's basically the way to go.
Awesome.
Cool.
Well, I know you have stuff going on right after this. You're a busy guy, so we'll be cognizant of that. Definitely want to have you on again and talk about more.
Yeah, I feel like the conversation's just getting started.
Yeah.
Yeah, we planted some seeds here, so I had to restrain myself a little bit. So I just want to express some gratitude for the container you guys have created, the relationships that we have, and would be honored to be to have this conversation over time. So until next time.
Yeah, man.
All right, thank you, Evan.
Appreciate it.
Thanks,
Fantastic.
Evan.
Cool.
Bye.
He said that microorganisms are self-organizing, right? And I agree with everything he said about Elaine Ingham's work. I think it's amazing, valuable, and have to be in balance with other things. That's been my experience as well with that. But you think about animals like sheep or chickens, or integrating animals into these systems. Their manure, right? Don't they sort of self-select for microbes in that way? So you're actually taking that sort of on a more macro level, rather than, okay, I'm brewing my compost tea, which is obviously important, it's got its value, but like the animals are brewing it in their own digestive system in a way.
Right.
And so like integrating all of that to it, I think that's how you get to, a really awesome system that is really self-sustaining. And it reminds me of the mineral imbalance too. So Greg Judy is an incredible, pasture management animal expert that is, he's got a YouTube channel, Greg Judy, and books and everything else. He has this system, he calls it free choice minerals. He actually puts all these different minerals that you would need to feed a cow in these little trays out when he moves them around the pasture. And the cows will only eat certain minerals that they need, that the grass itself that they're eating is deficient in, right? It's like, oh, this grass is deficient in sulfur or whatever, so I'm going to go in here and eat a bunch of sulfur, because they know how to do that. So then when they poop in their manure, it's got all the minerals in it that they ate. So they're actually fixing the mineral balance as they go through the pasture. I thought that was the most brilliant thing I've ever heard of.
That is amazing.
That is
I'd love
amazing.
to talk to Evan about, animal integration. I think it's fascinating.
That's what those are a couple of my questions I had, was more animal integration. So we'll have to have him on again. That was very interesting.
My experience in California is I brewed compost tea a lot, and, I did it all the right way and found it to be kind of a pain. And I never saw any results at all, to the point where I stopped doing it and I kind of viewed it as a waste of time. And now that I'm in Tennessee, I'm changing my mind about that. And I'd love to explore maybe why. Was I just doing other things right there? Is it like rainfall factors? Is it weather related? Is it just the uniqueness of the soil where I was working versus here? But I know I'm gonna get back into compost tea now. For sure.
And thanks, everybody. That's the show for today. Don't forget, like, subscribe,
And smash that notification bell.
and let's guide. Go. Come on down.
Like,